welcome to Common Sense Medicine, a podcast where we explore why common sense isn't always common practice in medicine. Today, my guest is Dr. Hilary Lin. She's a Stanford-trained board-certified internal medicine doctor and the co-founder and CEO of Curio, which is a health tech startup addressing health equity and outcomes via AI-enabled navigation. Dr. Lin's contributed to neuroscience and oncology with her peer-reviewed research work. She's also a frequent speaker and advisor for programs, including Headstream Innovation and Cornell BioVenture eLab. In her personal life, she enjoys immersive experiences and has completed over 200 escape rooms worldwide. Wow, I didn't even know there were that many escape rooms. Well, thank you so much for joining, Dr. Lin. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Sri. And there's so many more. I think there's at least like 10, if not 100x that number. And I only wish I had more time to travel around doing escape rooms.
Yeah, I mean, the life of a startup offers little to no escape. It's kind of all encompassing. But I'd love to talk about your current venture, Curio, and how you got interested in this space. And I think we could start at the beginning with your background in becoming a physician entrepreneur, because I think it kind of leads into the startup world. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to this point?
Yeah, and I love that because it's such a good place to start. I entered medicine to begin with back, I don't even know how many years ago now because the whole journey took over a decade. But I entered it because I was passionate about the human experience. And that sounds maybe a little bit vague, but what I mean by that is I know how complicated life can be and how important health is. And it's not just a matter of medications and surgeries and procedures. It's a matter of encompassing, all aspects of the human experience when you're dealing with health. So I went into medicine thinking about that as my passion and learning about so many patients' stories, and that really drove me. What I found when I was going through training, however, is that there's so much focus on the facts of medicine and the facts of biology. And while I love that, I think it sucked a little bit of the soul out of medicine during that
Yeah.
time period. Yeah. And, we're being asked as physicians to know way more facts than even 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, because that's the pace at which knowledge is increasing. And so in essence, we're being asked to be computers. And that's a whole new topic that I'm really excited about. But I think that AI has a real hand in the future of medicine for this reason. Offer that human perspective and experience in care for patients. And I think that artificial intelligence is a big boon to the industry because now we can rely on an external source of facts to help aid us with those human decisions. So, but anyways, back to my journey. I went into medicine passionate about the human experience, and that's what drove me into oncology, because in oncology, that's the field where patients think most about their mortality, about their existence. There's a lot of existential questions that come up when you're facing such a serious and life-threatening condition. And a part of me wanted to be very deep in that process. Another part of me was very frustrated once I got into it because, as every oncologist knows, the practice of oncology is a lot of just running in and out of clinic rooms or hospital bedrooms, and you don't get a lot of time to actually sit down and understand and feel that human experience with your patient as you might want to. So as I was going through training, internal medicine training, and then I was briefly in oncology fellowship at Columbia after Stanford, I realized that there had to be a different way that I could get involved with, solving these big existential problems in healthcare. And so I went into digital health innovation. So in the beginning, I wandered through the various fields of digital health. It's kind of the way I would phrase it, because I did everything from cancer screening to relationship wellness to sleep health and to general mental health. And finally, where we are today, which is in the patient navigation and patient support space. So And there's a common thread throughout all of that, which is, I have all along been passionate about understanding the human experience behind what it is to be a patient in a very complicated healthcare system.
Yeah, that's a very compelling story, and I think a lot of patients can resonate about this. I think health literacy is one of the worst things that we kind of address as doctors because one, we want to finish out the visit, right? We want to make sure that we treat the patient, but also there's this idea of does the patient even know what the next steps are? And sometimes they're surprised, right? To your point about cancer care, I think that's the most nerve-wracking experience because it's you can't get a diagnosis right there. You have to get a biopsy, you have to get biomarker tested, and then you can only get a vaguely get a sense of what the treatment plan is. And even if that, there might be more pathology stains to run to make sure that the treatment that you're getting is the best, most optimal treatment. So I understand the frustration that a lot of patients feel. I think for me, one thing that I would love to learn more about is your own pivoting from one thing to another until you landed on the patient navigation space. Why was it so compelling for you, and how did the interest as well as your mission align with this particular space?
Yeah. And this took me a long time. And that's why for years I was essentially seeking a field to land in for innovation. And it developed out of my own learning about the healthcare ecosystem, honestly. In the beginning, as a relatively new founder, I, like many founders in healthcare, I went straight to what I thought the problem was. And oftentimes when a new founder in healthcare does that, they create something like a tech-enabled clinical platform for
Yeah.
a specific problem, like, GI issues or whatever it is. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just that it's the first order solution for a problem, usually. And as I learned more, as I started a company in that space, that very space, we were centered in mental health, for example, and I learned that there's a big complex system behind it all that if we don't tackle a bit more directly, then all of these other solutions are not going to pan out in a way that really impacts patients at their core. And what I mean by that is we started to see that people with more complicated or more serious healthcare concerns, a lot of it came down to navigation problems. Like people, like you mentioned, health literacy, health access, health equity. These are problems that are incredibly prevalent in the United States. I get that they are in other countries too, but especially in the United States where we have such a convoluted and complicated system, it's become almost impossible for people to get optimal care. And even when they get the optimal treatment per se, they are not getting the optimal experience, guarantee it. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I knew that I wanted to work on something that fought this essential problem, the core of this problem, rather than at the surface. So that's what drove me more and more into this rather vague name, I would say, of a space, which is patient navigation.
Yeah.
When you say that to a person, it's too big of a topic. I think you need to get down into the nitty-gritty of like, what is it about patient navigation that you're tackling?
Yeah.
How is it appearing in whatever innovation that you're creating? Well,
Yeah, that's a great segue into my next question, which is around what is Curio? How did you kind of package the solution, and who are your end customers for the solution that you've kind of created?
yeah. I like to phrase it as what problem we're solving. So
Okay.
we essentially help patients get the resources they need in order to optimize their health. So that sums it up in one sentence well. And the tooling behind that is, a specific thing which I can describe, and it's growing all the time. And it's becoming much bigger of a platform even in our early stage. The one example of tooling that we provide is a natural language powered search, where instead of having filters, we all have seen digital apps where you ask a patient, what do you need? Do you need financial help? Do you need, whatever, transportation to get to XYZ? So instead of having these broad segments of pathways, which are actually in reality very difficult for a person to navigate, we offer a person a small way to tell a part of their story, essentially. And that might be like, I'm having trouble getting to my next appointment, or, I don't have childcare to help me for next Tuesday's, chemo treatment or something like that.
Right.
And either in partnership with a human navigator or in a self-serve, self-empowered, patient-driven manner, our tools can help get that person the very precise resource that they need, or set of resources that they need. The next level of that is actually helping them apply for, or guide them very specifically through the steps of getting resources. Because if you've ever been through that journey with a patient, like often it's case management or social workers who do this with patients, the arduous nature of like, getting a resource, like filling out a financial assistance application, or figuring out where to get money to pay for like Uber Health to transport a person, that's incredibly hard to navigate already. So that's like next level, and that's also like the next phase of what we're developing.
Yeah, I think that's very poignant. I think I remember a time on my internal medicine sub-I where I was tasked with making sure that the patient knew how to get their home oxygen because they had COPD and they needed to be connected with a service to get them the home oxygen. And not in cancer care, obviously, but also it's a very big hurdle for a lot of patients, especially if they're underinsured or uninsured. I think a good place to take this conversation would be, could you walk me through like a step by step of what happens when a patient maybe comes in for their first treatment in chemo or radiation when they have been diagnosed with cancer, and how does Curio sync up with them to kind of walk them through that process? Because I imagine it's a very stressful process. They may need to take time off of work. They may need to get some therapy. How does that work with Curio?
Yeah. So the key thing to understand is we're actually a B2B company, so we
Okay.
interface directly with health delivery platforms, nonprofits who provide supportive resources, and other similar entities like patient support programs. So much of the time, I would say a solid 80 to 90% of the time, there's actually a human in the loop, such as a social
Okay.
worker or a patient support personnel person. And we offer them the tools so the patient can either access them themselves, or that support person can, access our vast database and resources to better serve that patient. So that being said, an example might be a patient is, diagnosed with cancer, and they have a regimen scheduled out for them, and they perhaps are having trouble paying for a certain medication. In that case, a patient support staff person can look through our easy to use and personalized, and we even call it precision level resourcing. That's
Hmm.
how detailed we get with our tooling. So rather than being like, I'm looking for a patient assistance program for this drug that's available in this zip code, you can get even more specific and describe specifically, this person is, this age, this, they have these family members, and you can create not only a bundle of resources for them, that you can watch metrics for, so you can see if the patient is actually accessing them. So we provide some of that data, but you can also create the language around it. So we have an element of communication support. We do that with, some generative AI, and also through experience, we also have some messaging that aligns to people specific literacy level. And so that social worker or patient support person can therefore deliver like this all-in individualized resource package to a person over something as simple as a text message or an email message.
Interesting. As a as a someone who hadn't had that much exposure into the cancer navigation space, I think one question that comes to mind is, how are patients most frequently communicating with the care navigation expert on the line, either email by phone, and what services are they typically using, which is the most common, frequently asked for service to connect them to?
Yeah, yeah. Financial support is by far the biggest problem, and financial toxicity is the main focus for the inaugural year of Cancer X, which is Biden administration's cancer initiative. And
Gotcha.
I gotta say, I think just finances alone probably takes up
Yeah.
80% of people's bandwidth and mind share. Uh,
Gotcha.
cancer care is so incredibly expensive that most people max out their out-of-pocket spend if they are insured. Um,
Yeah.
and there's a few other conditions that are that expensive, but just to give you a sense of how great that burden is. Um, secondly, there's legal related type concerns. So people have questions all the time about employers, like their workplace, what their rights are, accommodations, or like leaves of absence related to that sort of work related legal questions. And there's also for people who are in end of life or, I say, I often tell people there's never a too early time to start preparing your estate. And that goes for really anybody, but certainly if you have a diagnosis like cancer, even at diagnosis, it's not too early to make sure that everything is in place. So estate related questions are also quite common. A lot of people don't want to navigate that sometimes, but they know they must. So making that as simple as possible is really important. And a lot of the emotional support piece is also incredibly important. That's actually what brought us actually into this space because Curio, for those of us who know us from our uh, earlier rendition, we focus primarily on mental health support. And we noticed
Gotcha.
that our patients with cancer and other serious illnesses, that they almost first and foremost were too worried about money and logistics
Yeah.
so that they didn't quite have the bandwidth to talk about their emotions until much later. So that's kind of what brought us more squarely into what is formally patient navigation. But, people do eventually end up there where they need that emotional support. So helping people navigate luckily there's so many resources now for group support, one-on-one support, even if it's just education to help relieve that anxiety around like, what am I dealing with? What should I expect? That can reduce anxiety so much just to know like what is there for you. Um, actually, on that note, the last thing I'll say about if there's ever been a study that the most anxious day and the most anxious moment is often the moment you get a diagnosis. That's like, yeah, you hear patients all the time. They say they hear nothing else after they hear that they have cancer.
Yeah.
And everything after that, of course, it's stressful, but that first moment is probably the most painful because it's a shock to the system. It's a
Yeah.
transition that you're going to have to go through and you're not ready for it yet. Everything else, you have a little bit more time to, prepare. You get used to it, actually. People are often surprised. They get used to having this very serious diagnosis, and then it becomes like almost a project management task of just managing a complicated illness. So,
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting that finances and estate planning are so big on the horizon, especially with work, when you would think that's the last thing that people are thinking about when they're like, oh, I need to kind of make sure my health is on the right place. But you're right, because of in this country we have this third party payer system that's linked to employment. It's more about making the care affordable equals having a job versus making care affordable is just like making sure that I'll get the best care that's accessible to me if we were in, for example, a single payer system or something else where you're not worrying about working in order to make sure you have the ability to access your care provider, which is really interesting. I think it's a great service that you guys are offering. To bring yourself point back to the point where you're saying we're a B2B business, we sell to healthcare companies. Are you selling to employers or someone else? I wasn't particularly clear on that.
yeah, it's because of how complicated the ecosystem is.
Yeah,
We actually sell to what might be best described as intermediaries. So,
gotcha.
well, actually, let me correct that a little bit. So, we offer navigation and utilization discovery services. You can imagine our tools are almost a better way for a person to discover a set of resources. So, we
Gotcha.
interface directly with healthcare delivery platforms and systems, so providers in essence. but we
Gotcha.
also interface with the vendors in the larger industries of employer benefits and also the
Gotcha.
pharmaceutical industry. So to break that down, in the employer's system and landscape, it's quite complicated for those of you who have, those listeners who have dug
Yeah.
into it. There's third-party administrators, there's brokers,
Right.
and everything else. So we interface more with those intermediaries rather than directly, because we're not a direct benefit to the employer that you would purchase necessarily. And then
Gotcha.
on the pharmaceutical side, we interface with the patient support programs that are vendors to pharmaceutical manufacturers. And we also,
Gotcha.
yeah, interface with nonprofits and patient advocacy groups.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think for me, I had heard of patients using companies, I think like With Me Health or the Grand Rounds or Included Health, and they are offered to employ self-insured employers who are kind of looking to add a benefits manager type company or as a benefit to kind of direct people to existing benefits that may be underutilized, like a Livongo Teladoc or a Lyra or an Omada Health. But it's interesting. Could you explain more about those health delivery systems? And is that a function of because there's so many point solutions for like MSK Health, all of these like different types of patients, are they trying to round them up so like employers have one place to go to deliver all of these benefits for care navigation?
Yeah, essentially, yes. And I'll also add an additional point. So, yes, the healthcare system has, and the whole ecosystem has essentially become overwhelming. So,
Yeah.
like, yeah. So even employers, and they're, dealing with a large population of employees, they can't deal with it anymore. They're just like, please help me, like benefits
Yeah.
administrator, like just organize all of these things and sell me a platform of benefits so that I could just offer a little bit of everything to all of my people. So
Gotcha.
that's one way to sum up what's going on, and that occurs in other areas too. Like I'm starting to see that consolidation happen in the pharma space, in the health system space as well, because there's way too many point solutions, and so that's one thing. Another thing is we do what we do because we actually want to be useful and to have true impact. And not to disparage, other companies, but I think in such a complicated healthcare system, when you try to do too much, you cease to be useful to the end user, the patient, essentially. Um, so for
Right.
example, if you think of care navigation and you want to solve care navigation, you might start to create a top-down system where you're like, okay, I'm going to create programs and tracks and pathways for people with cancer, people with going through, childbirth, whatever. Like you might create issues-based pathways for people. We know now, like it's been maybe a decade in this experiment of patient navigation innovation, that those types of pathways are so minimally useful that there's like a single digit utilization of these types of
Right.
resources. Uh, so clearly it's not working. Something's not working. It was a good effort. So what we have opted to do instead is we get much more nitty gritty and granular about the level. So instead of offering, for example, okay, you have an MSK problem, musculoskeletal concern, you could there's a portfolio of offerings like Sword Health, Hinge Health, whatever. Instead of doing that and offering that sort of top-down pathway, we get down to the nitty-gritty. We're like, okay, these are the types of resources available across the landscape in musculoskeletal care within Sword Health. Like they do
Gotcha.
whatever it is, this specific piece of education, this video, even like that's the level that we're getting granular
Wow.
to. And that way you can deliver that specific thing to a patient, not like an entire platform that a patient ends up having to do a lot of navigation through.
Yeah, that's really cool that you could get that granular. Is that enabled by just the company's API, or how are you finding that level of granularity? Is the AI kind of recommending that?
Yeah, we have a combination of how we do that. So one is through partnerships. So when we have a close partnership
Gotcha.
with an organization that owns these resources, then we're better able to just index based on, they usually have an internal
Right.
database. And if we are not formally partnering that closely, or maybe there's just uh, an entity that wants access to our library of, more generalized resources, we do a combination of human and automated collection of resources, essentially. So it's also quite effective, but we prefer the direct partnership because then we can almost handholds or hand guide or just like guide a person through the steps of a resource rather than,
Right.
just offering a link to a particular resource.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Which brings me to the kind of financial upside for these health delivery companies to partner with vendors such as yourself. How does the monetization look like for the companies that you're contracting with, or at least like even the employers? Is it like a per month per member allocation for your attributable patients, or is it a per engagement model? Or I'm trying to understand how these verticalized providers for these different conditions are getting paid now that they're partnering with a bundler.
Yeah, yeah. It's very complicated and everybody is different. We
Gotcha.
have essentially tiered utilization based pricing model. That's how I would
Gotcha.
describe what we charge. As for the delivery companies, there's a whole planet of reimbursement
Yeah.
models that they use. Like some of it is more traditional billing, like fee for
For
service in
sure.
like a health system. And
Got it.
for digital health providers, it can be PMPM per member per month, or it could be by utilization. We we align well with those who are paid based on utilization because,
Mhm.
like I mentioned, not only for navigation services, but for digital health and other sorts of benefits, there's such low utilization of
Yeah.
those benefits that you get paid really little because nobody's using whatever you're offering. And that's
Yeah.
the direction that a lot of health innovation, health tech is going, because now there's a flurry of digital health providers. So employers
Yeah.
and all of their intermediaries are almost demanding that level of type of reimbursement. So
That's interesting you brought up providers because that was my next question. You're a provider, I'm a provider, and we've interfaced with hematologists, oncologists. How are they thinking about these care navigation tools, and how do patients interact with the provider when they say, "Hey, I'm using this new tool. I'm gonna be using it for stuff that's going outside, like they're giving me resources for therapy, for example, or like other providers that I can talk to."
yeah, yeah. It's all about trust. And that's a huge, huge reason why we believe in authentic relationship building in the ecosystem. So, the first thing we're doing is establishing strong relationships with both leading and also smaller patient advocacy groups. And we do that to an extent that it's more than just a logo on our website. In fact, we haven't even started doing that because, that's for show. But in reality, we want to develop those real relationships so that they know us and we know them. And in some cases, we'll even place our tool, like say on their website, or offer their specific, once we've indexed their resources into our tools. When speaking from a provider's perspective, like truly, when a patient is able to find support outside of the clinical setting, it's awesome because like it's a um and there's a couple of reasons like at the hospital system level, it's because hospitals don't get paid very much for offering supportive care. It's not a very high, it's not even billable currently. I know CMS is actually creating a billing code for care navigation, but who knows like what that will actually pay. It's still pretty early.
Right.
And in addition, so it trickles down. So a doctor, for example, as much as they want to help, they're being paid by like RVUs and like how many patients they can see and how much they're billing. They're not being paid to sit in a room and think of like all the supportive resources. So oftentimes it gets delegated to a social worker, or sometimes there's a palliative care team, which is amazing. So it's already being outsourced in essence.
Yeah.
And when a patient has a resource like a patient advocacy group or someone who sits beside or on top of it, like Curio, I think that's an amazing thing. So, yeah.
I think that equally as amazing is finding someone who's found that resource outside and it's working for them, because I think then they're more likely to stay adherent on their treatment, come to visits, follow-ups, etc. Right? I think that a happy patient and a a patient who has things outside of the clinic working for them is more likely to show up in clinic
Yeah.
and more likely to show up for future infusions, right? Treatments like that. To my point of my, to the point about like what's happening in the clinic as well, medications are a huge driver of spend, right? And employers are throwing away money down the drain if the patient is not taking the medication. So if they're taking, for example, a drug for rheumatoid arthritis and they go off after 6 months, but they have like a 12-month prescription, that's money that the employer is kind of essentially throwing down the drain, right? How does Curio work with the patient experience in the clinic as well, just to make sure that the doctor is involved, or that is not in the purview of the services that Curio covers?
Yeah, we actually are, also working on that pharma side. So
Okay.
we, there's so in the tech world, we are familiar with the phrase like customer success. And now
Right.
we're starting to hear here and there the phrase like patient success. And
Gotcha.
in a similar way, it's about patient engagement and supporting them through a process. Like if they do need a medication and it's good, it's like beneficial for their treatment, then we definitely
Hmm.
want a person to adhere to that treatment. If it's a problem with the treatment, like they have terrible side effects or it's too
Right.
costly, like the copay or something like that, it's beneficial for everybody in the ecosystem to understand that as well. So
Right.
we do provide visibility for entities that where we're integrated with. So actually, not in an individualized manner because there's regulations against this, but
Right.
the in an anonymized and bulk cohort manner. Pharma companies care a lot about this for obvious
Right.
reasons. Perhaps they want people to be adherent to their medication, so they stay on
Right.
them, so forth. Um, so there's already a culture and a system of real world evidence, real world data being delivered to the pharma entities. Uh, Health systems also have ways of understanding this, but it's not as baked into current innovations unless it's a clinic-based innovation, because as you can imagine, there's only so much bandwidth to take in extra data. But theoretically, like through using a patient support system like Curio offers, a doctor could find out these things faster.
Gotcha. And to my point about the clinic experience, I'm harping on this because in cancer care, people, for example, a relative might say, "Hey, this doctor is not the best. Maybe you should go to Memorial Sloan Kettering and get a second opinion." Right? How does Curio help or how does Curio deal with kind of patients wanting a second opinion, and are patient asking for Curio's help to find another doctor to get that second opinion?
Yeah. So we do not directly offer second opinion services, but some of the
Right.
advocacy groups that we work with do offer services to help with that.
Gotcha.
Our philosophy is actually that second opinions are valuable, and a lot of oncologists recognize that too. Um, Hopefully, everybody is operating at the
Yeah.
frontier of evidence. And but
Right.
that's not always possible. Like if you're out in the community, you might not have access to the pioneering drugs out there. So
Right.
it can be helpful to work in partnership. When I was at Stanford working in the oncology clinics and also at Columbia, a lot of people have two oncologists at least. Like they're working with a community oncologist as well as an academic
Gotcha.
one. And the academic one's almost like this director from
Yeah.
the remote being like,
Yeah.
okay, like, this is the kind of protocol that we would recommend and maybe like
Right.
adjust it or maybe, stay in touch. We'll let you know when this trial opens up. And then the community oncologist is the one who is delivering care more day to day.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And you mentioned the academic clinician in that care team is talking about directing the care and also is aware of the frontier of cancer research. How does Curio work with finding clinical trials which the patient might be eligible for, and how does it work with enrolling them? Because I understand that's like ancillary, but it may offer solace for people who have, for example, triple negative breast cancer, and they're trying to find that solution for them, and they're trying to get involved in studies.
That's actually a data set that we're working on after the financial one. So finances and legal resources have been our main focus thus
Right,
far, but the trial data and
right,
information about open trials is our next target, essentially. And we don't anticipate. I know there's so many trial matching platforms out there. That's not going
yeah,
to be, our core business model by any means. We just view it as another like individualized resource that we can provide for people. And we believe strongly in the importance of trials. So we want to do that. Um, so the 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 real problem actually around clinical trials is lack of comfort from the patient's perspective. I actually think
right,
once a patient wants to be on a trial, you've already solved 90% of the problem.
gotcha.
So, yeah, most patients are just scared of it. They think they're being experimented on, which is, you could spin it that way, but I think there's a lot even before the matching problem that needs to happen. I was speaking yesterday with one of our nonprofits that we work with, Black Myeloma Health, who she is the leader of that group. She actually goes out and advocates like on foot. And she loves
Yeah,
it. She's so passionate about it, and it's so necessary
yeah,
because in communities such as Black cancer patients, there's a deep mistrust of healthcare often. And
right,
when there's deep mistrust of healthcare in general, you can imagine that nobody's signing up for clinical trials. So
rightfully so.
yeah. So it's hard to cross that barrier without having people whether they're advocates, volunteers, like people who have lived experience going out there and convincing those populations that this is safe and this is needed to make sure that new treatments are actually, safely being tested on your population so that you can have better care in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I think your point about the trepidation of getting into a trial is very poignant. I think it's even if I was a cancer patient, I would, and I'm a doctor, I'd still be very fearful of kind of getting into an experimental procedure. Even then, I'm on the placebo, I'm on the actual experimental arm. I'll be thinking about that, having kind of knowledge of how clinical trials work, right? I think everyone's just like, I don't want to be in the arm that's not getting the treatment, and just I want to be on the standard of care essentially. So that's a very interesting idea. How do you even approach the topic of trying to persuade someone on that? Is it like a chat that kind of tells them this is the risk, like this is the arms, like you might not get it, but I guess being more informed during the consent process is where I think AI can actually help with this.
Yeah, a lot of it is pure education and doing it at a level that a person is comfortable with. And we do this in so many different ways, but the core message is actually being on a trial. It has been proven to be better for your health, whether you are on the control arm or the experimental arm. That's actually absolutely true according to past research done. And the effect is believed to be related to how closely you're being monitored. Whether you're on control or experimental, you've got way more people making sure that you're getting appropriate care. People are supporting you through that care a lot more closely. And so it's not hard to imagine why, no matter which arm you're on, you actually have a better outcome than you would otherwise. So that's first of all. And then the second piece is, in cancer and all other types of healthcare trials, we're very careful when in trial design to make sure that if you're getting the experimental arm, you're not missing out on the advantages of the control. So oftentimes with cancer care, for example, you're getting the standard care plus, the experimental drug or experimental immunotherapy, whatever it might be. So
Right.
yeah, so certainly people don't miss out, and that's like a requirement in trial design nowadays. So I think The tricky thing, of course, is the extra burden of any experimental treatment. Lots of new treatments, especially these, you know, pretty miraculous immunotype therapies, are quite complicated. For example, take CAR T therapies. Like, you need to get so much more involved. You need to go in for more visits. You need to be inpatient for a while. Um, and so it's quite involved. But that being said, we're discovering new treatments that actually work to, maybe even cure. Like, we're starting to use
Yeah.
that word sometimes. It's scary to use in cancer.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. We're starting to see what looks like cure. Oh.
Yeah. I feel
Mhm.
like that, yeah, a lot of patients shy away from that word. We call it, I guess, remission has been the term
Yeah,
du jour, but I think that cure is, as we're inching towards it, it'll feel a lot better when you're saying, yeah, you're officially cured from cancer
yeah,
versus
yeah,
you're in remission. We'll kind of monitor you, you know?
yeah.
I think it's so I switching topics a bit. I was reading a generative AI market map that was published in June of this year, and I thought one quote was really applicable to our conversation. It said that these type of companies, meaning patient care navigation companies, face challenges like overcoming vendor fatigue and budget constraints in current economic climate. And interestingly, these companies have the largest amount of funding in the category of patient-facing apps, but the lowest amount of median funding per company, which implies that the category is more saturated and less capital intensive than other patient-facing categories. So in your experience as an operator and very much a person who's knee deep in this space, is that your perception of this kind of patient care navigation space, that there's a lot of actors and you're trying to kind of carve a niche out for yourself to make sure that the patient retention is there, that they'll really like the product? And it's like, to your point about getting that grassroots support, trying to find those patients who will kind of stay with you and are sticky towards your product.
Yeah, yeah. We have to be successful in the one thing that most, like 99.9% of health tech companies have not been successful at, which is actually being good at patient engagement. And
Gotcha.
that's the hardest thing in the world to all of us in innovation, but it's so necessary. And that's our reason of living or existing, really, is that we want to actually be useful. So the I think up until this point, health tech has always been a few years behind the rest of tech. And you see that in the products that are coming out even today. It's like, why are we only now thinking of, like, modular based education for whatever?
Yeah.
It's like it's actually, very frustrating. We know better now, just based on, what's happening in, marketing and sales even, and or advertising, or like just any other field of technology. You can find best in class practices that really, really work. And you go to health tech and you're like, we're just not doing anything right. It seems it just seems incredibly outdated. Uh, so what we are seeking to solve is that problem. It's like, we need to be able to solve this with technology. Um, oh, something I will say is a lot of care navigation and similar types of companies today, they use humans to help assist with the navigation. And our thesis is that people need to rely on so much human labor because they have not cracked how to create individualized uh, solutions with tech. So, but with generative AI, we now can. It's just the existing companies, they were built in such a way that they're completely reliant on human labor now. And you can imagine it's a huge lift to build up a technology team that can build now these generative AI powered unique resourcing types of tools. So that's the difference that we're working in, and that's why we're building what we're building today and not even like 2 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, super interesting. And one could even make the case that generative AI and AI in general requires a data set in order to be more effective, and getting in more types of data to have that predictive analytic capability would maybe involve getting Fitbit data or getting the steps, getting maybe Apple Health, like how well did you sleep last night? It might indicate that, for example, my Aura Ring told me like a few days before that my temperature was increasing before I got COVID. It could be that type of kind of indication that even before they're ready to go see their doctor, it might even alert them that, hey, your temperature has been spiking. Are you feeling okay? Is it side effects because of the medication? Maybe you should go talk to your oncologist. And I think that's where it could get really interesting,
Yeah.
avoiding side effects before it happens.
Yeah. I actually think, it's Apple has been well positioned for this,
Yeah,
because they're the hub for all of the integrations, and that was a long-term play, and you have to be an Apple to be able to do
yeah,
that. Um,
exactly.
so what innovative companies do is to plug into that hub and use what data is available in order to, serve better results. We are not at that level yet because, we're still working on things like
Right,
financial and legal resources.
right,
But, that is the dream, is how can we tie in and integrate into these subtle biomarkers and details of a person's everyday experience in healthcare. Oh,
yeah. And I think looking forward, I think the conversation where I'm thinking about where do you imagine Curio and yourself in like the next 10 years? Do you see yourself like branching out into other aspects of the cancer care, not just being a 360 experience, but actually providing some of these services to patients? For example, is there a telemedicine play here, or like where you employ social workers as a navigators, but also they can provide therapy, for example?
yeah, there's definitely two ways to go about it, and the future is still unknown, but the direction that we have plotted out is actually to expand our tools and our data sets to other fields of healthcare. So providing that broader layer we find is more useful, and it also aligns with our vision, which is that a human person is more than their disease. So the more we can bring in other aspects of healthcare, whether it's other condition types, or if it's even, towards wellness or like nutrition or other aspects of care, that's our eventual dream, rather than necessarily becoming verticalized in a single condition like cancer.
Interesting, interesting. I think one thing that I find from physicians that we're very programmed to be in a linear pathway, right? And you
Mhm.
mentioned that I think we were talking about this before we started the podcast, but you had started your fellowship and you had seen that operating in a system like that isn't where you're going to make the maximal change. What made you think that digital health was the right next step for you, and how did you find your legs as an entrepreneur?
Yeah. It took me many years, and I think that's something new founders should be aware of, is that it takes a few years to really understand what business building is all about. Um, and it's one of those things, it's like, it's probably better maybe not to know in the beginning so that you just have this sort of diluted optimism going into it.
Yeah.
So it took me years to get my legs under me. The reason why I wanted to go into digital health, though, was a general sense of tech optimism. I fully believe that we are living in a world where healthcare is incredibly stuck in this outdated mode of manualized labor. And also that, just looking, very closely to any other industry, you could see like, wow, like everyone else, even like games, is moving forward at this lightning speed, where we're seeing like virtual reality, and we're seeing, intense personalization, and sometimes to a person's, disadvantage, like in the case of social media.
Right.
Now we've gotten real deep in that, but why can't we use technology like that for good and scale up the care that we give? It also frustrated me greatly that physicians, we're so educated. We've been, every single one of us has more than a decade of education and training by the time we start practice. And with all of that education, you are basically being asked to churn through, pretty repetitive tasks. Even
Yeah.
caring for patients, even if it's a complex patient population, a lot of times you can imagine a world where it's not such a highly educated human who's going through these repetitive tasks. So I wanted to help build that world where we can use our talents where they are best. And, some of that is in direct care. I still do some direct care because I love it. But I think there's so much more we could do if we applied our minds into the broader world of innovation and technology.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to kind of conclude the podcast. I would love to leave the listeners with where they can find Curio, where they can find more of your thoughts, and any recommendations that you have for listeners to read about the space.
Yeah, you can find Curio at everywhere join Curio. So joincurio.com. That's our handle on everything from Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn to Twitter. And then for me, I'm Hillary with two L's, Hillary Lynn MD on all of the same platforms. You can find my blog posts on Medium.